David Thompson never thought that a routine Tuesday at Crestview National Bank would change his life forever. As branch manager, he prided himself on keeping everything under control. Every transaction was scrutinized, every policy followed to the letter. It was this attention to detail that ultimately secured him his position. The lobby was bustling with the usual lunchtime flow of people when she entered. He noticed her immediately, a young black woman wearing a simple blouse and slacks, nothing flashy. She seemed out of place among the usual customers, made up of professionals in suits and wealthy pensioners. David watched as she made her way over to one of the cashiers, Lisa. After a brief conversation, Lisa pointed to his office. Great, he thought. Another special case for him to handle.
Mr. Thompson, this client has a large check she'd like to deposit. I thought you could take care of it personally.
Called Lisa. He nodded briefly and called the woman into his office. When she sat down, he noticed that she had a confident and discreet demeanor. Still, he maintained his suspicions.
How can I help you today, miss?
He began.
Johnson, Amara Johnson.
She replied with a polite smile.
Very well, Mrs. Johnson. I understand you have a check to deposit.
She nodded and handed over an envelope. He opened it, his eyes widening as he saw the amount. $1.5 million. Warning sirens immediately started going off in David's mind. In his 20 years of banking experience, he had seen every kind of scam imaginable. This had all the hallmarks of a classic fraudulent check scam.
Mrs. Johnson,
He said slowly,
I'm afraid I can't accept this check.
her brow furrowed.
Excuse me? Why not?
David leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully.
Well, for a start, this is an extraordinarily high amount. We have strict protocols for deposits of this size. May I ask where this check came from?
It's from the sale of my tech startup. I can provide documentation if necessary.
She replied calmly. He laughed to himself. A convenient story.
I see. And you chose our bank for this transaction because...
Because I'm an old client.
She said, with a slight tone of irritation in her voice.
I've had accounts here for years.
He pulled up her information in the system. In fact, she had had a basic current account open for 5 years. But the balance was modest, nothing to suggest capacity for a transaction of this size.
Ms. Johnson, I hope you understand that we take fraud very seriously here at Crestview National. Large checks like this, coming from unknown sources, raise suspicions. I'll need to see extensive documentation before I even consider prosecuting you.
He said firmly. Her eyes flashed with anger.
Unknown sources? I said it's from my company's acquisition. Are you suggesting I'm trying to commit fraud?
He held up his hands conciliatorily.
I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm just following protocol. Perhaps if you were a more established client, things would be different. But, given the circumstances, I'm afraid I can't help you today.
Amara Johnson stood up abruptly, her chair dragging on the floor.
I can't believe this.
She said, her voice shaking with restrained fury.
Is it because I'm young? Because I'm black? What exactly about me screams fraud to you, Mr. Thompson?
David felt his face burn.
Now you see, Mrs. Johnson, race has nothing to do with it. It's purely a question of bank policy and risk management. If you can't understand that, perhaps you'd better look for somewhere else to do business.
She laughed bitterly.
Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that you looked at me and decided that I couldn't have earned that money legitimately. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Thompson. You made a big mistake today.
With that, she grabbed the check from his desk and stormed out of the office. David watched her go, a mixture of anger and discomfort churning in his stomach. But he pushed the feeling away. He had done his job, protected the bank from a possible coup. Surely his superiors would agree. The next morning, David arrived at work to find an unusual commotion. Whispers and stares followed him as he crossed the lobby. Before he could settle in, the phone rang. It was Janet, the regional manager.
David, I need you in the conference room. Now?
Her tone sent a shiver down his spine. He hurried upstairs, his mind racing. Had there been a security breach? A serious complaint from a client? As he entered the conference room, he held his breath. Sitting at the head of the table was Amara Johnson. But she wasn't alone. Next to her were Janet and Gregory Walters, the CEO of Crestview National Bank.
David, please, sit down,
Said Janet, her voice icy. He sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. Mr. Walters snorted.
Mr. Thompson, I understand that you had an interaction with Mrs. Johnson yesterday. Could you explain your actions?
David swallowed.
Sir, I was merely following the protocols for large deposits from unknown sources. Given the amount and the circumstances, I thought it prudent to request additional documentation.
Amara Johnson stared at him.
And by circumstances, you mean the fact that I'm a young black woman, correct?
No, that's not what I meant.
David tried to explain, but was interrupted by Walters.
David, let me be clear. Mrs. Johnson is not just a customer. She is the principal shareholder of Crestview National Bank.
David's world spun. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process the information.
But how?
He managed to stammer. Amara leaned forward.
Remember the tech startup I mentioned? It specialized in financial technology. Crestview acquired it last month for $1.5 billion. That check you refused to accept? It was my first dividend payment as the new owner of this bank.
The next hour was a blur of apologies, explanations, and veiled threats of legal action. When David finally left the conference room, his career at Crestview was over. He was given the choice of resigning or being fired. He chose the first option, if for no other reason, to save a little of his dignity. As he tidied up his office, the weight of his actions fell on him. How many times had he made rash judgments based on appearance? How many customers had he treated with suspicion or disdain simply because they didn't fit into his limited vision of what a typical customer should be? He remembered all the times he had prided himself on his impartiality, his objectivity. But the truth was that he had been operating on autopilot, allowing unconscious prejudices to guide his decisions. And it had cost him everything. As he left Crestview National for the last time, David saw Mara, or rather, Mrs. Amara Johnson, the main shareholder, talking to a group of employees in the lobby. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw not triumphalism or arrogance, but a deep sadness. At that moment, he realized that her actions hadn't just hurt him. They had reinforced the barriers and prejudices she had probably faced all her life. He walked out into the bright sunlight, jobless and humiliated. But as he walked to his car, a strange sense of clarity came over him. This wasn't the end. It was a wake-up call, a chance to face his own prejudices and do better. Over the next few weeks, David immersed himself in a journey of self-knowledge. He read books about unconscious bias and systemic racism. He attended workshops and heard perspectives he had never considered before. Slowly, painfully, he began to see the world and himself in a new light. He couldn't change what he had done, but he could use his experience to educate others. He started volunteering at a local community center, teaching financial literacy to young people from disadvantaged communities. He spoke at industry conferences about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the banking system. Then, 6 months after that fateful day at Crestview, David received an unexpected email. It was from Amara Johnson. "Mr. Thompson," the message read, "I hope this message finds you well. I've been following your recent efforts with interest. Although what happened between us was unfortunate, I believe in second chances. If you are willing, I would like to meet to discuss a possible opportunity. His heart raced as he read those words. Was it real? Did he deserve a second chance? The following week, David met Amara in a small cafe. She seemed different, now more relaxed, but with an unmistakable aura of authority.
I'll be blunt, David, what you did was wrong. It hurt me and highlighted a serious problem in our industry. But I was impressed by your efforts to educate yourself and help others.
She said after they had exchanged greetings. She paused, taking a sip of coffee.
Crestview is launching a new diversity and inclusion initiative. We need someone who understands the problem from the inside out. Someone who can speak from experience about the dangers of unacknowledged prejudice. I think you could be that person.
David was stunned.
Are you offering me a job?
Amara smiled.
I'm offering you a chance to put things right, to use your mistake as a catalyst for real change. It won't be easy. You'll face skepticism and resistance. But if you're willing to put in the effort, I believe you can make a difference.
Tears welled up in David's eyes.
Mrs. Johnson, Amara, I don't know what to say. Thank you seems insufficient.
She reached across the table, touching his hand.
Don't thank me, David. Prove me right. Show the world that people can learn, grow, and become better. That's all I ask.
As he left the cafe that day, David felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, he felt hope. Hope for himself, for the industry he loved, and for a future where everyone, regardless of race, age, or appearance, would be treated with dignity and respect. David's story is not unique. Every day, people make judgments based on unconscious prejudices, causing damage they may not even realize. But it's never too late to change, to learn, to grow. I challenge you to examine your own prejudices. Question your assumptions. Listen to voices and experiences that are different from your own. And when you inevitably make mistakes, because we all do own up to them, learn from them. Use them as fuel